seats. Like I said, I do want to keep us all on time. I know quite a few of us will still be around if you have any other questions, but I did want to keep us on time since I know some people need to catch some flights. With that, the most fun of all the topic areas, budget and tax. With me, we have right next to me is Brandon Arnold from the National Taxpayers Foundation. Next to him, we have Joseph Henchman from the Tax Foundation. They're live and breathe this stuff. They're really good resources. I use them a lot for both federal issues and state issues. I guess I kind of want to just start off with kind of a trend topic. There's been a lot of talk over the last couple of years about tax reform, what's going on. Obviously, we've heard some of the stuff that's happened in Kansas. And I know we have some Kansas lawmakers here, and then also what's happened in North Carolina, which I believe just in the last couple of weeks they triggered one of their tax cuts. So why don't we'll just start with you, Joe. What do you see in kind of the landscape? I mean, those are the two biggest issues that are kind of taking up the steam. But what else is going on? Have you seen any traditional just trends in tax reform?
Great question, John. And thank you for inviting me here. It's a good chance to get away from NCSL, where I've been all day and will be all week. Just so I know the audience, kind of how many of you work on your tax or budget committee is your kind of primary legislative focus? Okay, so about half the room. And of course, as a tax expert, I know tax affects almost everything. So whether your primary focus is social services, of course taxes fund those things. If your primary focus is nutrition, there's a lot of talk about soda taxes out there, so that impacts that. And that's how I find myself purporting to be having expertise in things, a variety of things, including Bitcoin and marijuana, which is what I spoke on at NCSL, marijuana taxation, which I'm sure it's nobody in this room, but it's by far the #1 question we've gotten from state legislators over the last 2 years. How Colorado and Washington have done with marijuana taxation. And I can do a whole hour on that, but I'm not going to do that here. Certainly, I'm at the Tax Foundation, and we're a think tank in Washington, D.C. We're around for 80 years. We put out information on taxes all the time. And we have a federal team and a state team. I had our state team. Federal team's down the hall, and those poor guys every week come back to report how nothing has happened in Washington. And they've worked really hard
to get to that point.
So the saying in Washington is that you don't know how much work it takes for nothing to get done. Whereas I work on the state level, and every week we're reporting back, it's like this is going on, that's going on, and here's what's going on here. Lots of things happening at the state level, and that's why I love working on state tax policy. And I don't know, unfortunately I missed the earlier panels here, so I don't know how positive or negative they were about how things are going. But let me offer an upbeat note of positivity on state tax policy, because there is a lot of good news going on out there. A number of states, and I've jotted down some notes here, Indiana, North Carolina, Tennessee, and even the District of Columbia have adopted good reforms that improve economic growth, simplify the tax system, and lower rates. And there's stories behind all of those. I know we were going to have Senator Green from Tennessee. He couldn't make it because I guess you shouldn't fly Delta. But that was an example of just a senator who wanted to get rid of this archaic tax that Tennessee has had for decades and decades, a tax that very few states have. And get Tennessee to the point where they can say we no longer have an income tax, and it's now scheduled in law that in a couple of years Tennessee will become the second state to completely repeal its income tax, joining Alaska, which did it in 1980. And that was no small feat, of course. There was a million different ways it could have gone wrong, and that's just an incredible achievement. And then there's a lot of opportunity out there for other states to tackle their issues. And no two states are alike. That's the thing I learned almost immediately on starting this job. And so when our team goes around to different states offering testimony, offering advice, offering analysis, there is no one size fits all. I mean, it just can't be done that way. There are threats, and maybe we'll talk about those in a bit. Gross receipts taxes are a threat. We're in a state that seems to be crushed primarily by pension obligations, but also by an unwillingness to meet revenue with expenses, and I put Kansas in that category too, Pennsylvania as well. And then there's kind of the age-old crises of the sales tax and the corporate income tax, which are a lot of questions we get. What are the future of these taxes, because the economy has really changed from when they were first put in. So I look forward to the discussion and to the questions.
Do you have anything to kind of add? What do you see out there in terms of tax reform? Are you as upbeat and maybe as optimistic as Joe is on the state tax reform front? Obviously, at the national level, yeah, there's nothing moving. But
yeah, well, maybe I'm a little bit more pessimistic. I guess I haven't been at a marijuana panel all day like Joe has. But this is just a panel discussion, I assume.
Right.
Okay. All right.
No samples or anything. Okay, good.
I'm a little more pessimistic. I think we have had some great successes. To be sure, North Carolina is one of the real crowning achievements for the free market community in achieving state tax reform. Certainly there are imperfections, but I think that's kind of the blueprint now on how states ought to proceed, generally speaking. One thing that we do at National Taxpayers Union that is somewhat of a unique product is we look at all the ballot measures. We look at the referendum process in various states, and that's going to vary from state to state because, frankly, it's very easy to get things on the ballot in certain states and it's more difficult in others. But the trend line there, I think, has been pretty negative, unfortunately. We've seen a lot of bad proposals. I think in the free market community, we measure success on the ballot measure side of things by how many bad proposals we kill, not by how many good proposals we're able to pass into law. And that wasn't the case a few decades ago. Prop 13 in California, for instance, in the late 70s, and there's problems with that proposition, of course, we can get into, but and then Tabor in Colorado, that was in the late 90s, later revised in the 2000s, and there was a big push soon after that. When we got Tabor on the books, there was a big push for the free market community to try to adopt similar structural budgetary restraints through the referendum process. And unfortunately, we didn't succeed on any of those. And then for 6, 8, 10 years, we really haven't even tried. Meanwhile, on the other side of the equation, people that are trying to expand the size of government, trying to increase taxes, they've been much, much more aggressive at the ballot measure level. And they've seen occasional successes. Sure, we've beaten back some bad ideas, but we've seen some really bad ideas get through. And even when we've had success, Joe alluded to the awful tax that was passed in Nevada recently. That was originally killed by voters, the gross receipts tax, by an overwhelming majority on the ballot. And then just a matter of months later, the governor ended up pushing it through the legislative process. So that was a little disappointing. This November, we're looking at some very, very substantial ballot measures. Oregon being case in point, they're looking at a new business tax that could be really devastating for that state. I was actually looking at the numbers. It's a tax based on sales, not on profits. So it's one that's going to destroy businesses that operate at low profit margins like retailers. The finance, insurance, and manufacturing industries are going to see their tax liabilities increase by about 5-fold. And then the retail industry, again, which tends to operate at lower profit margins, looking at a 9-fold increase in total tax obligations. So that is going to be really something to watch carefully in Oregon. And
I've heard sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to say I've heard on good authority that the group that pushed that Oregon initiative did a typo in their proposal. They meant to add a new corporate tax bracket. And of course what they did is they created a gross receipts tax instead. And whatever, they're still going to push it, but I think that maybe it was just a mistake on their part, which goes back to the question of ballot initiatives, of legislating through that process rather than through the legislative process. I'm from California, so I've lived and breathed this my whole life.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the interesting thing about Oregon, I think, is, I didn't know that, Joe, thank you, is the main impetus behind doing this, behind bringing in these additional revenues. Sure, the usual education infrastructure, the politically popular things, but really what's driving it is pension obligations. And they are looking at, depending on what source you look at, anywhere from a $22 billion all the way up to maybe a $75 billion unfunded liability on their pension side. And I know many people in this room represent states that are in similar boats. and the threat of tax increases just driven by these unfunded liabilities is very, very severe.
Are there any ballot initiatives, I guess, that are more prominent than others? I believe, and you maybe get into this with some of the marijuana taxes, because I believe that is on the ballot in quite a few states.
Yeah.
5 states. Are there any other ones, or could you kind of talk about?
Yeah.
I wasn't really planning on getting on marijuana taxes, but it is something that keeps popping up.
I'll reference it briefly. Just piggybacking on what Brandon just said about pensions and taxes. States not coming to grip with these things, I think, is going to create pressure to solve it through the tax route more and more. And we're in Chicago. The mayor, Rahm Emanuel, just announced last week his proposal to add a surcharge to, I think, water and sewer
Water
bills,
and sewer, yeah.
and directly to pay for public employee pensions. We'll see how popular that is.
Just last year, they raised property taxes $700 million.
Yeah.
So every year they're coming back and they're like, well, we can't tax property anymore,
Yeah.
so let's tax sewer and water.
And then, more broadly at the state level here in Illinois, the governor, Rauner, came in and said, I'm willing to negotiate on taxes, but I want long-term structural changes on workers' compensation, on pensions, and on a couple of other things. And the Democrats in the legislature said, we're happy to talk taxes with you, but that other stuff's off the table. And that's where we've been for 2 solid years here in Illinois. And I wish Illinois was just a weird, exception and not kind of maybe the canary in the coal mine for a number of these. Oregon, certainly I think the #1 ballot initiative that everybody's watching, has got a lot of people scared because if it passes, I think it'll be an example that other states will look to as this new type of business tax that's very destructive. We haven't seen it since the 1930s. That's when the last of them were repealed at the U.S. level. It was the tax that the Spanish Empire used to have, and Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations wrote about how it helped destroy the Spanish Empire and allow for the rise of the United Kingdom. So we're hoping Oregon takes a very close look at this before they vote. Oregon votes by mail, so that moves the deadline up for the ability to educate people in Oregon on this considerably. The other one I'd point out, there are a number of ballot initiatives, of course, is Colorado. If you want to talk about Colorado, it'd be good. But it essentially would double the state's income tax through a payroll form to pay for universal health care. Whatever you think of universal health care, whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea, this thing is as well thought out and well organized as you would expect a ballot initiative proposed by some random person would be. And it's on the ballot. And there's a similar one in Washington State for a carbon tax.
Right.
That again, I think it was a comedian who came up with the proposal for this, and he's put it on the ballot. And
Well, Al Franken is a comedian as well. So
yeah,
I
that's
think
true.
the lines between comedians and politicians has become blurred.
So, lest I be accused of being a DC elitist, I'm very, very sympathetic to the idea of checks and balances and voter input on things. But you have very serious, very dramatic proposals that aren't really getting a lot of check and oversight before they go to the voters. And some states are very good about, here's the proponent's argument, here's the opponent's argument, here are all the implications. But some states aren't, and I'm kind of worried about some of those. For marijuana, very briefly, it's going to be on the ballot in 5 states this November, currently legal in 4 states plus DC, so if it passes in all of those, it'll roughly double. The big one to watch is California, which is on the ballot at a 15% tax rate. And, as California goes, so goes the nation, so we'll see how that goes.
What has been I know you guys have done a lot of work on what's happened in Colorado in terms of revenues. Can you kind of clarify, have the revenues that have come in been higher, lower, or about the same of what they expected?
On marijuana?
On marijuana.
Yeah, it's come in above projections. So they projected about $70 million a year. This year they're looking at about $160 million a year. Okay. How much of that is tourists coming to Denver just because it's legal there versus are the residents? That remains to be seen, and extrapolating it out for other states is a question. And I should note, I'm not advocating one way or the other that states or legislators pursue this. But if you are planning on doing it, or if you are thinking about it, or if it's going to be foisted on you through a ballot initiative, we have a lot of good questions that you should think about and policies you got to think about, because it's not just tax and it's not just you got to think about business licensing. You got to think about zoning. These retail stores, having them near schools and daycare centers. You got to think about health. You got to think about agriculture. You got to think about local law enforcement and a lot of other considerations out there.
So I kind of want to pivot a little bit. So we've talked a lot about kind of just general tax reform, but one of the trends that, at least over the last 5 years, at least since the economic recovery, if that's what you want to call it, a lot of these states are very scared in some ways to raise broad-based taxes. You really haven't seen, outside of Illinois, which even that one got rescinded. We had an income tax increase, but that sunsetted, shockingly, actually. But you do see states looking for almost low-hanging fruit, these targeted tax increases, whether that's on bottled water or the soda tax, which we saw in Philadelphia, hotels, cigarettes. What are your guys' thoughts on that type of policy? And do you guys see that as a trend as well? And what are the kind of the reasons?
Yeah, there's no question these so-called sin taxes are kind of perceived as low-hanging fruit, and we see those included in both Democratic and Republican leaders' plans very often. Kasich in Ohio famously, with his tax reform plan of a couple years ago, included a pretty significant cigarette tax increase. And yeah, we see that constantly. It's a very unstable revenue source, to be honest with you. The projections almost always exceed the actual revenue collections. And we've done some research at the National Taxpayers Union that suggests that almost always the people that advocated for these taxes, once they don't get the revenue they expected, come back and either ask for higher cigarette taxes or other types of tax increases. So it is not the way to plug your budget whole. There may be some ancillary benefits related to public health, but those are rarely more than political cover. Most of the reason why politicians advocate this is to try to bring in revenue to shore up their pensions or infrastructure or what have you. And now we're moving, as you alluded to, we're moving past just cigarettes and past just alcohol tax increases. We're moving into soda taxes. And interestingly enough, this kind of was the canary in the coal mine here was floating these soda tax increases through the ballot initiative process in a couple small towns, namely in California, some small, relatively liberal towns, including Berkeley, and they met with very mixed success there. Actually, they unexpectedly got their tail handed to them in a couple of these small left-leaning California towns. That didn't stop them. They went full bore. They've looked at a bunch of other municipalities, famously Philadelphia, just a matter of months ago, passed a very, very hefty tax increase on sugary beverages. And that was applauded by a mayor in New Jersey just across the river because he was ready to welcome with open arms all the consumers that would be chased out of Philadelphia because you're looking at $2 to $3, I think, increase on the price of a six-pack. They would instead come to New Jersey to purchase their beverages. So yeah, there's no question this is part of a trend, and I think as we see more and more municipalities begin to adopt these sin tax increases, they're only going to become more popular as folks look to plug deficits.
Yeah, make no mistake, there is a national strategy being pursued by the proponents of these types of taxes, and the tactic is to try it out in a couple of places to see how different narratives play, different proposals play, and once something works, to go national with it. And I mean, this applies to so many different areas of policy, but also to different types of taxes. More broadly, before the Great Recession, or whatever you want to term the crisis of 2008, state budgets grew at maybe 6 or 7% a year on average. There were higher years, there were lower years, but that was about the rough average. Now, going forward, in the last couple of years, our economy has grown at maybe 1, 2, or 3% a year. And state spending, of course, has grown a little bit faster than that, about 4% a year. It doesn't take long to extrapolate those trend lines out to see that there's a general crisis on your hands. And it goes to the question of whether you think the low growth we're going through right now is just an exception to the general trend and we'll get back up to it, or if it's the new normal. And a lot of budget directors that I've talked to are worried that it's the new normal. And that creates enormous pressure on state budgets going forward. And like I was on a panel at the Urban Institute not too long ago on this question of what should state governments do going forward. And most of the other panelists were like, well, you should raise this tax, you should impose that tax, you should raise this. And their solutions were all on the revenue side. And me, despite not really being an expert on non-tax things, wanted to steer the conversation more towards how do we get more out of the services that we provide now? What are the different options out there? And it's tough because it requires saying no when legislators really prefer saying yes to constituents. It's tough because it requires innovation and experimenting and being the first or the second to try something. And it's when you have experiments, there are also failures sometimes, and it's a very difficult situation. But the path of least resistance, the path of easiness, is to go this route of soda taxes and cigarette taxes. So just to use the most extreme example I could think of, it's my home state of California. Any Californians in the room by any chance? Okay, I got a couple. On the ballot, because everything's on the ballot in California this November, is a cigarette tax increase. I guess it's $2 a pack. And if you go through the ballot guide, California has a very good ballot guide. It's got all the information about the ballot initiatives. So if you go to the ballot guide, they line up where the revenue is going. The money is not actually going to the general fund. You would think that they're just doing this to paper over their put money in the general fund. It's actually divided out very cleanly to about 11 different recipients, all proponents of the initiative. So it's put a cigarette tax on everybody to fund the proponents of the initiative. The big line item it's going to is Medi-Cal, the state's version of Medicaid, healthcare for the poor. And so we're going to fund Medicaid, which rises in cost every year, with tobacco revenues, which, if you've seen the trend lines on cigarette smoking, declines every year. And so that's just storing up yet another budget crisis in a state that is riddled with them. And I see that type of thinking all over the place in tax policy. And I'm not a smoker. I really don't like, I'm one of those who doesn't like the secondhand smoke either. Got my dad to quit smoking with e-cigarettes. But, we're America, and if people want to smoke, they can smoke. And if you think it's a public health problem, then go the criminal route and try to pass ban smoking or something like that. But this idea that I'm going to express my personal preferences through the tax code and use it to punish people I don't like, it's a very problematic precedent. And when you start funding schools and funding healthcare programs with this declining revenue source on a small number of people, it really stores up long problems. I love education. I love public health. I'm sure everybody in this room does. Doesn't that mean we should all be willing to pay for it through broad-based general taxes and not just sticking it to that person who's a small group of people and we can assemble a majority to tax them?
And the other unfortunate part about that is that small group of people tends to be disproportionately poor. So you're taxing at a higher rate people that can least afford it to pay for health insurance for that same population. It's kind of a broken way to structure a tax system. And it's kind of creates a system of death by a thousand cuts here. These targeted different types of taxes, they're trying to deter certain behaviors, encourage certain behaviors. They're creating an absolute mess of a tax code in most states. And they're pushing back what state legislators like yourselves ought to be working on, which is fundamental tax reform, which is broadening the base, lowering the rate, things that are absolutely critical to sound tax reform policies. And this is just kind of pushing the problem back and burying our head in the sand at the same time.
So I'm going to ask you guys one more question, and then we'll go to the audience, because I do want to leave some ample time. Like I said, I promised to get you guys out on time. But before that, I did want to ask each of you guys a question. Shameless plug, I do a podcast with a colleague of mine on Fridays. We call it In the Tank. We talk about all things think tankery. And one of the questions we always bring on, so we bring on different think tanks, and the last question I always ask them is, if you were dictator for the day, what would be the one public policy solution you would implement? So let's say you're just, you live in Maryland.
I do. Yeah.
So if you were dictator for the day of Maryland, what would be the one budget and tax public policy that you would wave your magic wand and implement?
Wow, that's a tough one. I mean, Maryland actually is not a particularly well-governed state, and it's gotten a lot better. And I know we have 2 Maryland legislators there. This is like the presidential cabinet. You know how the members of the presidential cabinet can't all be in the same room at the same time. With 3 Republicans here, there's a 4th. We had to leave him back in Maryland. We can't all 4 Maryland Republicans be in the same room at the same time. Yeah, I mean, we need tax reform in Maryland in a big way. I mean, we have actually our sales tax rate is the one area that's not particularly egregious at this point, though it was increased under Governor O'Malley. I mean, we need fundamental tax reform in the state. So I guess that would be where I would look. We're a long way from getting there, given the political
income
makeup.
tax, or I mean, is that the major one that you would look at reforming?
Yeah, I mean, income tax is a problem. We have disparate property taxes across the state. The jurisdiction I live in happens to have double the property tax rate of any other jurisdiction in the state. It also has the worst education system in the state and the highest crime rate in the state.
Sounds like a lovely place to live.
It does, yeah. If anyone's seen The Wire, that's where I live. So yeah, I mean, I think the property taxes need to be restructured. So yeah, I guess we have so many problems. It's hard for me to drill down on one. Being put on the spot.
You're not going to be working for the Visitors Bureau of your district anytime
We're
soon,
making
no.
progress, but yeah.
Joe, what would be the one kind of
Sure.
thing you would implement?
Well, I suppose the right answer to this question is George Washington's, and that's to hand back the power without having to exercise
Yeah,
it.
that's
But
cop-out.
that's a cop-out, so I'm not going to answer that. A dictator for a day, I would fix state sales taxes. So any public finance experts, left or right, will tell you the right way to tax sales consumption is tax all final retail purchases of goods and services and no business inputs. Because if you tax business inputs, then you get pyramiding and cascading, you get taxes on taxes. So you should just tax everything at the same low rate, as broad-based as possible, at a low rate as possible. We don't do that in the United States. We do almost the opposite. We exempt a lot of goods like groceries and clothing and prescription drugs and so forth, and we also don't tax a lot of services. So we end up with, you go and buy a sweater at the Gap and you pay tax. I write a will, I'm a lawyer, I write a will for somebody, I don't have to collect tax. And the guy at the 7-Eleven, everything he sells, he's got to collect tax on. But the accountant, all his services that he provides, he doesn't have to collect tax on. It's bizarre. There's no public finance justification for it. It's entirely political. And if I'm dictator for a day and get to decree political stuff, I guess it would be that. The reason it's a problem is this was all designed when we were a goods-based economy. Today we're a services-based economy, but we're not taxing services. So that means every year the sales tax applies to a little bit less of the economy. Nowadays, it's about just under 40% of the economy is subject to the sales tax. And that means over time, every state has to ratchet up their sales tax a little bit in order to raise the same amount of revenue and or put pressure on income taxes, business taxes, property taxes in order to make up that gap. And those trend lines are not reversing anytime soon. We're going to be more of a services-based economy. I don't know if you guys saw the article about the McDonald's with no employees that they're trying out in Missouri. It's all touch screens and everything, and that's the future. And the pressure on the sales tax is only going to go up and up. We're going to be more of a service-based economy, and we've really got to fix that. No state has made that transition. There are some states that tax services, but they've always taxed services. Nobody's made that jump yet. And we're out there searching for the state that can figure out how to do it right, because then I think a lot of states are going to follow. The internet's part of that thing too, and I know that's been a hot topic in a lot of states.
So we'll go to the crowd. Looks like we have a couple questions. Ready first.
Hi, Roger Cates from Maine. I think we all want tax reform, but maybe nobody can agree on exactly what that means. But could you, maybe the three of you, comment on what role, if any, in a fair state tax system, what role, if any, an income tax ought to have?
Fairness is tough because, well, let me tell a story on this. We had a European delegation visiting. We get a lot of foreign delegations who want to pick our brains and or have a junket to Washington, D.C., and they have to stop by our office in order to justify it back to their home government. And we had a delegation of it was a EU delegation, so a bunch of, like 15 different European countries were represented in this. And they came by to, their goal is to basically label the United States as a tax haven. Because we've got a lot of business in the United States, and it's to their political advantage to accuse us of being a tax haven, which if you know how the U.S. corporate tax rate relates to other countries, it's ridiculous, but that's their mission. And so they came there, and so they were seated around with our federal team and talking about how they view things. And the chairman of this delegation was talking about how it's not right that corporations don't pay their fair share. And our president, my boss, interrupted and said, how would you define fairness for corporate taxes? And I mean, the guy's reaction was like he just said something about his sister or his mother or something. I don't think he'd ever thought of that, and it was just astonishing to him that anybody would ever ask that question. Because fairness, I mean, we all know what fairness is, right? And that's his attitude. And I think we all do know what fairness is, but we all have a different conception of it. And if I asked each of you to write on a piece of paper what tax fairness is, I think we'd get as many answers as there are people in the room. And so it's very difficult. And so that's why, for my organization, fairness isn't on our list of principles, because it's in my opinion, it's in the eye of the beholder. So we focus on simplicity, transparency, neutrality, things you can measure, things that you can be objective about. Ultimately, I think it's up to the citizens of each state to decide. Justice Brandeis called the states the laboratories of democracy, and I love that phrase. I didn't agree with Brandeis a lot. I didn't agree with the decision he wrote that in, but I do like that turn of phrase, because we have all of these different baskets of goods and services and taxes all over the country, and you can choose what you want. And how Maine finds that balance between taxes and the services the state provides, it can be different from how New Hampshire, for instance, solves that problem. And that's a good thing. But ultimately, I don't presume to know the answer to what fairness is. I think it's the give and take of the whole system. What's fairness, Brandon?
Oh, geez. I would echo Joe. I mean, it's in the eye of the beholder there. I would say, if John had asked that question about waving the magic wand on the federal level, the thing I would say would be wiping out the corporate income tax altogether. And I think the reason for that is because the tremendous amount of impact it would have on growth and job creation in this country. That being said, if you asked people across the board if that was a fair policy, I think that would poll very poorly, which is why I'd have to do it as a dictator, not as an elected official. But that's the kind of thing that I think would actually be a very, very positive tax change. But when you look at the state level, as Joe kind of alluded to, it varies tremendously from state to state what sort of system governments ought to adopt for tax collection. You look at Florida, which has such a heavy tourism function. It makes sense to have a sales tax and no income tax there. That's probably not the case in a state that may have significantly lower tourism. So every state is very, very different. I know Joe gets asked a lot. We get asked as well. I'm a state legislator. I'm working for a governor or what have you. What kind of income tax, what kind of tax system broadly should we adopt in this state? And it's a different answer for virtually every single state.
I guess the real answer when people are asked this, or people give an answer, I think what they're really saying is, don't tax me, tax that other guy.
I think there is, though. I think there can be made the argument that income tax is, by its nature, unfair. I mean, you're taxing people with their blood, sweat, and tears trying to make it up the ladder. And as you get up that ladder, especially a progressive tax, where you go from $29,000 a year to $30,000 a year, and you go up into another tax bracket. I think there is something fundamentally unfair about that. But you could say that for any other tax. I mean, if you rely on a sales tax, well, it's very regressive, so you're hurting the poor. So yeah, I think the fairness argument is a lot different than just say what is maybe the most pro-growth policy where allows the most people to benefit from it. And what we have seen, at least in the laboratories of democracies, is the states without an income tax are doing better economically. Yes, there's a lot of other reasons. Texas obviously has a lot of natural resources. They have a lot of other things going for them. Florida has tourism. But on the large part, those states do better. So if your definition of fairness is to create economic growth, well, I think you could make the argument that you should get rid of the income tax.
I mean, there's a reason Texas is still doing okay despite oil prices being in the toilet. I'm a very practical person, so I do have my ideological views, but in my job, my job is to help you work through ideas. And on income taxes, I handed out our little booklet here. Table 8 shows you how much your state collects in all different types of taxes, and income taxes for most states, it's a big lift to try to cover that.
Art Whittick from Montana. A tale of two states. Florida Governor Scott has been going around and saying that he cut taxes and that there is so much money in the bank that he has to cut taxes again. That's his story, and it's a good Republican story. Mm-hmm. Kansas now, the governor has cut taxes, and it's being used as a bludgeon in other states that want to cut taxes because everybody's holding up Kansas as the example of what's really wrong when you cut taxes. What is it about and then recently the primaries, a lot of conservative legislators who had backed the governor lost. So what is it about Kansas that didn't work?
You want to go first, or?
Pastors?
All right. Full disclosure, I criticized Kansas's policy before they passed it, when they passed it, after they passed it, to this day. So if you disagree with me on that, I'm putting my cards on the table where I stand on Kansas. And we have material on our website, and I can provide it to you of what they did wrong. The primary thing they did wrong was exempting pass-through income. I've heard all the arguments about why they did it. I still think it's bad policy and leads to budget volatility, and I think the facts have borne out my conclusion on that. Now, the good news for all of you who are not in Kansas is you can still cut your taxes, you can still reform your tax system without adopting that one piece that Kansas did that has caused so much havoc. And while it is true there are people and organizations out there saying all tax cuts and you will be Kansas, that's not the case. There's plenty of evidence of other states, North Carolina, Indiana, and others, that put the lie to that argument. And I'm happy to go and testify to your committees as somebody who is on the record, both in newspaper and on our website, criticizing what Kansas did and saying what you're proposing isn't Kansas.
What piece of Kansas are you talking about was so problematic?
I'm sorry?
What was wrong with Kansas?
Okay, so there were a number of different pieces to the Kansas reform. One of the pieces is a complete exemption for pass-through income. So if you are an LLC, an S-Corp, anything on your Schedule C, Schedule E, Schedule F, completely exempt from state income tax. And what you've seen is people converting their wage income people who can, converting their wage income through pass-through income. And I've talked to professors, I've talked to accountants, I've talked to lawyers. It is a gold rush of lawyers, accountants, small businesses, everybody who can. They're not increasing their economic activity, they're just shifting and recategorizing their tax revenue. Kansas has missed its revenue projection 10 out of the last 12 months, and God knows how many months out of the last couple of years, because they just can't get a handle. This is a big drain, the ability to take advantage of this provision that really has no end until they repeal it. And it was almost a political accident how they ended up with it, but it's a very problematic provision. And I know there's representatives in Kansas in the room, and I'm sure they'll rebut everything that I said and point out where I'm wrong on it, but it's not a policy I think any state should consider emulating. But as I said, it was just one piece of a larger thing. And I know the other side is making a big deal out of Kansas to stop a lot of good proposals in a lot of other states, and that's actually a big part of what we're doing right now is pushing back on that effort.
Yeah, especially with the bond rating agencies. I know in Georgia that's come up a couple times because it has.
Oh, you guys and your bond rating in Georgia.
But I mean, that is coming up. So they're using Kansas
Yeah.
as that. And I guess would simply, they cut the rate, but they also narrowed the base.
Yeah, I mean, as Brandon said, good tax policy is broadening the base and lowering the rate. And there are proposals out in Kansas, they narrowed the base and lowered the rate. And that caused problems for them.
think we have time for maybe 2 more
I
questions.
mean, that's the other, I'm sorry, just to, Senator Hill of Georgia pointed out they didn't cut spending, and that's another big part of it is if you are going to cut your income tax, and it was something like about a 24% cut in their rate and in their projected revenue, and made no plans on how to make up that gap. Part of it was you had some people come into the state and say, well, you don't need to cut spending because the revenue will appear through growth. And I'm a big believer in taxes affecting behavior, taxes improving growth. It's much more of a medium term and a long term impact than I think people in Kansas thought about. And like when we worked on North Carolina, the North Carolina legislature planned for the revenue cut associated with it. Turns out they didn't need to because it was designed so well. They've actually run some significant surpluses over the last several years. Indiana also. But that just goes to show that you've got to really plan these carefully, because a botched tax reform effort not only has significant problems for your state, it has significant political problems, as people are now losing re-election associated with it, and it creates problems for the efforts in other states because you're now held up as this negative example.
We talked about state-imposed taxation, but one of the factors that we'll deal with in state budgeting is the kind of regulatory tax imposed at the federal level, and in many cases, in fact, all cases under current rules, imposed by administered fiat.
Yeah.
And one of the last speakers in the last panel talked about the Convention of the States as a way to try to restore state power over their own budget and their own regulatory and their own competitive processes. I wonder what any of you on the panel think of the idea that without a convention, states might do what they did when they forced Congress or helped force Congress to propose the Bill of Rights. In other words, that if 34 states ever came together on a specific amendment, whether to ban unfunded federal mandates or to require that regulations be approved by Congress, that those states might collectively be able to force Congress to propose constitutional reform that would then give states with the most competitive tax and regulatory policies a real advantage that would be wiped out by what the feds do.
Yeah, I mean, the regulatory burden is a significant one, as you said. And there have been minor steps in the direction of the federal level to improve this. There is the UMRA, which is the Unfunded Mandate Reduction Act, passed several years ago, by which the Congressional Budget Office is supposed to score any unfunded mandates passed along to the state or the private sector once it reaches a certain threshold. CBO, unfortunately, does an absolutely lousy job of scoring those out and making that information known to state legislators and policymakers. That's a problem that needs to be fixed. We've seen some attempts at the federal level. The REINS Act is something you guys are all probably familiar with, and that would actually, when an agency at the federal level proposes a rule, if it hits a certain budgetary impact threshold, it would have to be affirmatively approved by the Congress before it could take effect. That would go a long, long way to rolling back the regulatory state or preventing additional regulatory creep and impact on state governments. The Convention of States is another way. I'd say that's probably a longer shot, but realistically speaking, we need to do more. Just making CBO make those costs of regulations more transparent to policymakers would go a long way to providing the transparency necessary to push back on the rulemaking process. And then if we can get the REINS Act, that's a heavy lift, get that across the finish line. That would be huge at the federal level. And it's something that state legislators ought to look at. There have been similar bills. I know North Carolina we've been talking about a lot. North Carolina has been talking about doing a REINS Act at the state level just recently. They've done a very good, every year I think that McCrory has been the governor. They've pushed back in some way or another against additional regulations. And they're talking about, like I said, a state-based REINS Act, which would be absolutely phenomenal.
I'm in a really good mood today because I just on the ride over here.
Because you're at that cannabis meeting.
Well, there was that too, but on the ride over here, learned that a judge ruled. The judge we're suing the IRS as a class action on behalf of tax preparers on a regulation of theirs, and the judge ruled to certify our class action against the IRS's motion to dismiss. So, I mean, that's it's almost an all of the above policy. The litigation route, the state legislative route, the voter route. I don't know. Not one of them has proven to be the silver bullet. And there are people out there who've got their solutions that if we just do this, it will solve all of our problems. I'm not one of those people. I'm in the trenches, pulling every lever that I can see. Finding every provision, every strategic avenue. And I'm much more of an incrementalist in that way, so I can't really opine on some of the other efforts that are out there. It's a huge mountain to climb.
Well, with that, I want to thank our panelists for joining us today. If you could give them a round of applause.